Kia ora koutou, good morning. Welcome to the Infrastructure Committee meeting of the 4th of November. A few housekeeping matters I just want to cover. First off is that this meeting has been live streamed on the Council YouTube channel and will be available afterwards. The health and safety for this facility is there in case of an emergency, please leave the site immediately nearest the closest fire exit and assemble out the clock tower in the square. It's a non-smoking facility, there's a defibrillator in the link span, and if there's any accidents, please contact a committee administrator. Councillors, if you wish to speak, just announce your name before you do, and that's for the recording. And now I'll move on to our first item, which is apologies. I have an apology from the Mayor for early departure on council business, but maybe that's a, yes, so maybe that's a late arrival and an early departure. And I also have an apology for Councillor Petrinas for late arrival.
For the Infrastructure Committee meeting, I'll have early departure on council business. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll move those apologies, and seconded by Councillor Hancock, and call for a vote. Yes, just Councillor Hancock. That's passed unanimously, 13 votes for and none against. Councillors, in light of the fact that we have concurring meetings with community development and we have a presentation from Countdown from Mr. Matthew Granger coming in from Auckland, so we'll adjourn this meeting to 11 o'clock to take that presentation from Countdown, and then adjourn if there's any remaining business for community development to complete that before we continue with the rest of our business. So a little bit of a chop and change, but we'll adjourn now to 11 o'clock and pass it to Councillor Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dennison. We'll now open the Community Development Committee meeting. We'll start with a karakia timatanga. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei Māori ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai ki tēnei hui, te iwi o rangatane tēnā koutou, te konehiro papaoia tēnā koutou, e nā mana e nā rea, nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So we'll start with apologies. And we have apologies from Danielle Harris, from Councillor Petrinas for lateness, and from the Mayor for early departure on council business. Councillor Hopton, no? Okay.
Madam Chair, apologies from the Mayor for late arrival as well.
Okay. Do we just need to convert that to an apology full stop?
No, I believe he'll be here at some point.
Thank you. So I'll move we receive the apologies. Seconded Councillor Dennison, and we'll vote, please. And that is carried 13 for and none against, no abstentions. Thank you. So item 2 is additional items. Late items. I haven't been notified of any late items or any additional items. Are there any? No. Okay, we'll move on then to declarations of interest. So I've got one declaration of interest, I believe, from Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to note an interest on item 8. My husband works for Manawatu People's Radio, and it's mentioned a few times in that report, but I don't believe it's a conflict of interest in terms of receiving this report.
Thank you. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't believe it's a conflict to withdraw from, but I just want to note that I'm a Mid-Central District Health Board member for presentation number 5, but won't withdraw. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Finlay. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. Have we got those noted? Yep. So move on to public comment. Now, I've been notified of one public comment from Fernandez Maki. Are there any other public comments? No? Okay, in that case, Fernandez and Matt Martiki, would you like to come and make public comment? So you'll have 3 minutes to make comment on an item on the agenda, and I understand your comment is on item 10, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so just make sure your microphone is on with the green light showing.
Yep.
Yep, and away you go.
Morning, Madam Chair and Councillors. I'm here to speak on item 10. I'm Fernandez Maki. I'm a whānau order worker in the Highbury community. Work for Te Wakahuia Manawatu Trust Health Centre. I'm here to speak in regards to 2 issues we're having down there at the moment. One is the consumption of alcohol at the shopping centre. We've had numerous complaints from community, youth and shopkeepers about the constant consumption of alcohol by people, which is causing a lot of havoc down there at the moment. There's been quite a lot of fighting, urinating in bushes there, unsafe for the children that are finishing school. We've noticed that these people start drinking around about 8 o'clock in the morning and carry on right throughout the day, majority of the time. There's a table down there where they congregate and drink. Sometimes cars pull up down there. We have 4 schools just within the vicinity of the Highbury Shopping Centre, and majority of these children are having to walk past that every day, and it's quite concerning for their safety as well. So that's been brought to our attention. So yeah, we were wanting to see if the council would put some signs up in regards to maybe our alcohol bylaw down there, stopping drinking and alcohol consumption at the shopping centre. So that's come from the community. I've spoken with shopkeepers as well. They've been complaining about it for a long time with the police as well. So that's issue 1. Issue 2 is about the traffic on Highbury Avenue there, the speed in which the traffic is moving. We've had Kaumatua, and with the amount of schools in that area, I think we only have 1 pedestrian on that road, and that's down towards Somerset School. And if you look down there, I've taken photos, so I can pass those on as well. There's not many yellow lines, and there's trucks protruding oncoming vehicles, seeing children at that crossing. Last year, I think a child was hit down there, and there's multiple intersections just in that little area as well. And with the amount of people that we have that are in relation to drug addictions and that down that area, there has been a lot of speeding up and down the Highbury Avenue, Rhomberg Street, Pembroke, and yeah, it's quite a concern for the amount of kids that are crossing those roads. That's been a real concern for us as well. Nearly been a lot of kids that have been run over down there, even Kaumatua on their mobility chairs have come close to being hit. We're wondering what suggestions there is from a council point of view that can be put in place down there to ensure safety for the community regarding the speed. There is a time zone for the speed, but yeah, that's my 2 issues.
Thank you very much. I'll just see if there are any questions from councillors. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for coming in just for the public comment this morning. Interactions that you've had with the police, can you just describe how frequently they've been called in respect of both the matters that you've actually talked about this morning?
Well, The police have been called quite a few times to the Highbury Shopping Centre regarding the alcohol consumption, because there has been a lot of fighting over there, a lot of urinating there's a bush specifically on the corner of the shopping centre where a lot of them urinate, and that's the main pathway to cross over the road there to the next, across Pembroke. So the children have to walk through that every day, and yeah, the police have been notified quite significantly by the local shopkeepers and public regarding that situation.
Yep, thank you very much. Just to be noted there, Madam Chair, I've taken a note of those two matters and I'll refer that through to the Safety Advisory Board. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hancock. Deputy Mayor Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for coming in to speak to us. Just a question around the drinking around the Highbury shops. Is there a liquor store, or is there somewhere where they're purchasing alcohol and then consuming it outside, or are they congregating there and I guess bringing their own from home and using that as a meeting point?
Yeah, there is a liquor store at the Highbury shops. There's actually two alcohol wholesalers there. There's the Four Square and the Big Barrel. But what we're noticing is a lot of these people that are sitting at the table is homebrew. A lot of them are drinking homebrew, and they're congregating in one area, which is the table. There's only one table down at the shop, and that's the main pathway to get to the shopping centre for these kids and whānau and kaumātua.
So would it be fair to say that the location, in terms of it being at the shops, would just be a coincidence, but actually they're really using that table set up as a place to meet together?
Yeah, the table's the main issue, and has been for quite some time.
Thank you. And then my next question was, through you, Madam Chair, to the Chief Customer Officer, is just in regards to getting some information back to elected members around reviewing the safety concerns that have been raised of the road, and also obviously looking at the drinking that's happening. Would you feel that we would need a recommendation to come through for that feedback, or is that something that you can pass on to the appropriate departments and informally report back to us?
Can you leave it with me? I'll just take a check and come back and see what.
Sure, thank you.
Any further questions? I don't think the queuing system is working, so you'll need to indicate. No? Okay, in that case, thank you very much for your public comment, and that has been noted. Thank you.
Thank you. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa.
Kia ora. Okay. Right, so I'll move that the public comment be received for information. Seconded Councillor Dennison. Is there any comment? Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just like to acknowledge Fernandez for coming in and bringing this. I think it's his first time in council, and it's quite a daunting process. We will understand that first time. So just like to thank him for coming, and just pass on that his comments have been noted, and we'll move forward from here with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And no further comment, then we will take the vote, please. And that has passed, 14 votes for and none against, no abstentions. So next item is item 5, which is a presentation on behalf of the Mid Central District Health Board, and that will be presented by Dr. Syed Zaman. So Dr. Syed, would you like to come down now? And you'll have 10 minutes on the traffic lights to do your presentation, followed by questions. And if I could ask you just make sure that your microphone's on. Thank you. When you're ready, thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Morning, Madam Chair, councillors. As you've heard, my name is Syed Zaman. I'm a consultant geriatrician, and I am the clinical executive for Te Uru Whakamaora, or the Healthy Aging and Rehabilitation Cluster at Mid-Central DHB. Thank you for inviting me to present to Council in support of the paper regarding community connectedness and seniors. I think you'll all be aware of the changing demographic, not just in New Zealand, but also worldwide. Older people are at increased risk of loneliness for a range of factors that are listed here. Loss of spouse or partner, longevity, having outlived friends. Now, frailty is a condition that becomes more prevalent with increasing age, and it's associated with an increased vulnerability, not just to physical stressors, but also to social stressors. Sensory impairment, cognitive impairment, and dementia also put people at greater risk of loneliness and may go unidentified. Older people with depression and anxiety can be hard to reach, and the combination of mental illness and loneliness forms a vicious circle. Also important to remember that many older people are carers, despite having their own mental and physical health problems, and they experience social isolation and loneliness as a direct consequence of their caring role. So older people living alone are 50% more likely to access emergency care services. They're 40% more likely to have more than 12 GP visits in a year. And recent research has shown that loneliness is an independent risk factor for admission to aged residential care. So perhaps tackling loneliness may be a way of enhancing well-being and delaying the need for institutional care. Loneliness also increases the risk of heart disease, stroke, hypertension, dementia, depression, and suicidal thoughts. And again, research has shown that loneliness does increase the likelihood of death, and the effect is comparable to other well-known risk factors for death, such as obesity and smoking. So how can we prevent loneliness and support older people? Access to high-quality health and social care is critical in enabling people to engage in society and stay connected. So providing treatment for health issues that limit independence, such as chronic pain and visual impairment, identifying and treating depression, cognitive impairment, dementia, will make a difference to the risk and impact of loneliness. There is a stigma associated with loneliness, so older people may not volunteer this information. There are opportunities to better identify loneliness, and this should be built into routine practice. As you are aware, many of the services to help address loneliness are provided by voluntary organisations, so it's really important to develop and foster partnerships with the voluntary sector. So social prescribing refers to the practice of GP teams directing patients to community workers who offer tailored support to individuals. It's important that the needs of Māori and other ethnic groups are considered, as well as the needs of older people, for whom socialising itself is a challenge, for example, those with mental illness and those unable to leave their own homes. I'm going to skip the next slide. So I'm just going to give you 10 tips to build connectedness in a community. So user involvement increases the impact of interventions and can take a variety of forms, from people giving their views and feedback for research, to co-design and co-production of initiatives, or even to governance and decisions led by users. Volunteering itself can fight loneliness by increasing self-esteem, skills and capacities, and improving physical and mental health. Because they feel more connected with society, volunteers tend to feel happier. And older volunteers in particular enjoy the opportunity to give something back to the community. An asset-based approach focuses on what is strong in the community rather than looking at problems and deficits that need to be fixed. The key stages of asset-based community development, or ABCD, are listed here. So mapping the capacities and assets, for example, people's time, underutilized buildings, public spaces, building relationships and connections between residents to change values and attitudes, mobilizing residents to become self-organizing and active by identifying common interests, and convening a core group of residents to identify a key theme that will inspire people to get organized and create a vision. There's strong evidence that certain group activities can reduce loneliness in older people, for example, having shared meals or community gardening. And the most successful group activities are those that offer something else desirable, such as learning, sport, or music, and a user-led, such as coffee mornings. Activities should enable social contact to continue outside of the group. The most common one-to-one connection is befriending, and that's particularly useful for those with mobility problems. As I said earlier, there is a stigma to being lonely. 1 in 3 people are too embarrassed to admit it. So how do we address this? I think the answer is that we change the narrative. We encourage people to be part of something that is working rather than focusing on the problem. Terminology around age and demographic can also be a barrier. Very few people consider themselves as old, so they may not participate in activities for older people. So emphasize intergenerational approaches and target activities at all ages. Also talk about champions instead of volunteers and improving well-being instead of reducing loneliness. An age-positive approach can be a great enabler to combating loneliness. Emphasize healthy, active aging and reject negative stereotypes of aging. So the World Health Organization has developed a network of age-friendly communities to foster healthy, active aging and encourage a positive mentality amongst a wide range of organizations and institutions within a local area. Making age-friendly communities creates new meeting spaces and ways into additional support. So most people, as you know, spend a significant amount of their time in their immediate neighborhood, so locality has a significant influence on well-being. There is strong evidence that focusing on neighborhood can combat loneliness. People who feel that they belong to the neighborhood and who trust others are less likely to experience chronic loneliness. There's also clear evidence that the built environment and local area infrastructure is essential to support vibrant social networks. So good transport links, community facilities, and people-centered design are all important. And for older people in particular, a lack of appropriate transport can be a major barrier, but the transport has to be accessible and affordable. And lastly, harness digital technology, but do this carefully because there is evidence that it can both help fight and exacerbate loneliness, particularly older people who may not be digitally literate. Technology can be used to identify where loneliness exists in our communities by using proxy measures for loneliness, such as marital status, self-reported health status, age, and household size, so you can create a heat map of loneliness, which can improve allocation of limited resources. There is evidence that video conferencing technology such as Zoom and Skype, which I'm sure you're all familiar with now with lockdown, do reduce loneliness in older people. So technology-based provision offers support to people who are hard to reach. So I'd just like to finish with a couple of examples of successful neighborhood approaches. So the Leeds, this is in the UK, of course, the Leeds Neighbourhood Networks contract is delivered by 37 locally based schemes run by committees that are representative of the communities that they serve with the aim of enabling older people to feel included. The scheme delivers a range of services, largely by volunteers, and many of whom are older people. So they run things like dementia cafes, social prescribing schemes. And the data collected thus far has shown a positive shift in all outcomes, especially the outcomes of keeping in touch and feeling positive. And the second example is the Rural Coffee Caravan. So this delivers information and friendship across Suffolk, which is a county in the UK. And it provides a mobile drop-in space for over 5,000 people a year to connect people with, just through conversation over coffee and a piece of cake. As a result, people have set up community groups and made new friends, and people have felt valued and appreciated. And by volunteering their time, people feel they are giving back and have a sense of belonging. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Would you be happy to make that available to elected members?
Certainly.
Yeah. We'll get you to liaise with the administrator. Thank you. Are there any questions? Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Zaman, for your presentation. To prevent loneliness, one of the suggestions is to improve identification of loneliness, right? Are you asking this measure to be observed by the local government or DHB or the general community, number one? Number two, are there any clear ways to do that?
So in answer to the first question, I think it should not just be the duty of DHBs or healthcare professionals to identify loneliness. That is something that can be done by the general community, by the voluntary sector, by carers, even by families. And your second question was about, are there tools to identify loneliness? There are, and I can share those with you.
Okay. Thank you.
There is just
Thank
a
you.
simple question about, do you feel lonely? But there are other slightly more sophisticated tools to identify loneliness.
Thank you. That was helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Syed, for this report. I've just got a couple of questions. One, in regards to this report, you've looked at a lot of things happening overseas and things happening in New Zealand generally. Have you done much work specifically for Palmerston North around loneliness?
Now, the work that I've done is more about raising awareness, and the job of actually addressing it is one that's ahead of us all.
Yeah.
But I know that there are many councils, including Palmerston North and the Horowhenua, have already started to address this.
Yes, fair enough. I guess my question is, do we know how big of an issue loneliness is here in Palmerston North?
I don't know, I don't have figures for Palmerston North, but Ahmed's paper suggested that the prevalence in the over 65s in New Zealand is about 8%.
Okay. And another question I was wondering for your thoughts on was around that, the whole terminology around age and demographic, and how some older people don't feel like they're old, which is entirely fair enough. You're as old as you feel, I reckon. But with that, do you have any ideas on what we could do to sort of bridge that gap a wee bit? Because there is, from what I've seen, a disconnect in terms of younger people being able to connect with the older generations, and also having those barriers there and trying to bust them down, because it isn't young people versus old people. It should be all of us working together to live on this planet happily. Do you have any suggestions on what we could do to sort of bridge that?
I think an intergenerational approach is certainly something that we should consider. There is evidence that children interacting with older people, particularly in care homes, does break down barriers and teaches tolerance and respect for different generations. So that's possibly something that we could look to implement locally amongst care home residents.
Excellent, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Zaman, for your presentation to us. Just wanted to pick up on one of the 10 areas of action that you're suggesting around facilitating transport, and just wondered if you had specific information or specific insights that you might have in the Palmerston North context around what's working in that space and what could work better.
Short answer is no, I don't have specific information. I guess I know anecdotally from dealing with a lot of older people with chronic conditions that limit mobility, who are isolated geographically, that they would struggle to attend community activities that, aimed at promoting connectedness. So it is something that we're going to need to address if we're going to reach some of the most vulnerable members of our population.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Dr. Zaman, for your presentation this morning. My question through you, Madam Chair, really is probably to council officers. In terms of the criticality of housing and the likelihood that where there is a great need for social housing projects going forward, are there any formal processes for inclusion of communal social spaces into future projects?
I think, so just sort of following on to the conversation that was had a couple of, I think, committee meetings ago when we were talking specifically about the Papioia Place. I know there was, there's been some assessment of that, but I think it is part of a piece of work going forward in terms of from sort of generally. But we haven't got anything specifically right now. I think that's right, David.
Well, any social housing project or any housing project for that matter, we're looking at, and the district plan requires us to apply urban design principles to those developments now, and typically that's a key part of what those principles involve is looking at common and shared spaces. So we, typically where you have a high density development with smaller outdoor space and those sorts of things, the common areas are important and a key part of any urban design assessment.
Yeah, so is it specifically covered, or is it just generally sort of covered under a sort of blanket expectation that that might just be sort of something that is considered?
It's generally covered.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Butt, you had another question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just following your comments about most or many people don't want to be recognised as old people, is there any official definition of being old or age when we declare somebody old?
Yeah, you say 21. Yes, I think it's can be quite subjective. I think the official definition of an older person in New Zealand is 65, but for Maori it's 55.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Sharman. Around the types of housing, have you done any sort of surveys on what type of housing the people are actually living in? Are you talking right across, like, I'm assuming that people that live in sort of retirement villages are not as lonely as people living in single housing in the community?
You would think that. But actually, despite being surrounded by a lot of people within an aged care facility, loneliness is not uncommon. So it's important to even to include institutions where you might think that people are interacting frequently with others and loneliness may not exist, but it does exist. It's pretty common in aged care facilities.
So even though they've got the facilities and the meeting, okay, thank you.
Any further questions? Okay. Dr. Zaman, thank you very much for your presentation. We appreciate it. And thank you for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Councillors, we will need to resolve that the presentation be received for information. Yes, you may comment after the presentation has been moved and seconded. Thank you. So I'm happy to move that. Councillor Hancock is happy to second. Now I will open for comment. Councillor Finlay.
Just basically in reply slightly to Councillor Barrett's comment on transport, Age-Friendly Palmerston North is working at the moment quite intensely with Horizons to try and get some sort of pattern for older people in transport in the city. We've spoken to Horizons Transport Committee and Horizons, and we're going back for another meeting very shortly.
Any further comment? Okay, in that case we will put the vote, please. And that is carried 14 votes for, none against, no abstentions. So our next item is a presentation on behalf of the Disability Reference Group, and that will be presented by Ms. Rose Body. So, Rose, would you like to come forward? And I believe we just need to change over the presentations. Morena Rose, I'm sure you know the score, but as 10 minutes with the traffic light system, and just make sure that your microphone is on. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. thank you for this opportunity. Right, okay, sorry. Yes, please, I'm a bit random. Right. So, firstly, while this opportunity to thank the welfare team that was up and running through COVID-19, for many disabled people who were very suddenly, of course, needed to remain at home. They had no way of accessing their groceries or medicine from pharmacies, and I know the welfare team stepped in and made sure that these things were delivered to people. So that made a huge difference. So thank you. I'd like to say that firstly. Right. So 2020 has been a strange and difficult year for everyone. And obviously our meetings were put on hold between April and June. We've had a couple of extra meetings to try and work through what we had planned. And in the meetings that we've had, we've actually had a lot of topics and issues that we've discussed. The February meeting, a couple of days before we went into lockdown, ironically we talked about the emergency management for disabled people and on the concept of how to actually, for a council perspective, how to locate or understand who are the vulnerable people that need to be sort of reached in an emergency. So that's an ongoing process. Of course, the Accessibility for Streets for People development program, and I have to say, it looks pretty good. I've heard only good things about it, and I love zooming across all the new paths, so watch out for me. I go in two, and I don't necessarily stop. Okay. Also, we had a great discussion around accessing an artwork in Palms North and developing a mobile app tour guide, so watch out for that. Active citizenship plan, and that was another really kind of useful discussion, and I have to say, it's being someone who sits in lots of meetings and with officials, it's been really, really positive to have such officials come bringing information and really wanting to share and really wanting our ideas, because sometimes in other kind of meetings for other places, you get the sense you're just literally there to make up the numbers. So, you know, I'm really, really impressed with how the officials bring things to the table. Meeting the needs of disabled people and events. Again, it's an ongoing sort of process, but we've made big strides this year, and I think even more so for next year. And of course, the 10-year plan, where would we be without at least one discussion within a year or two on the 10-year plan? Some of the things also discussed were achieving mobility parking compliance outside of current hours. I smiled wryly because in the last week, after hours, I couldn't find any car park at all, mobility permitted car park available, which is a bit sad. But we'll carry on with that. Signage at public toilets. Of course, on the group, there are people with lots of varying experiences of disability impairments, and they had a huge kind of ideas to put to how the signage could be better improved in public toilets. The wild-based recovery accessibility, we were encouraged to go down and go through that, and I did so a few months ago, and I was really, really impressed how they manage, given what they have to do, i.e. keep the birds within their confounds, and yet still making it accessible. So I was really, really impressed with that. So the parks and reserves accessibility and memorial park development. Thank you, we got to put a discussion around that as well. One that might be a bit surprising to perhaps to some present is equal opportunities at Palms North City Council. In part, that also covers volunteer opportunities. The disabled community would love the opportunity to take part in volunteer opportunities at the council. And often people don't know about them, or it's only short notice, or other things need to be teed up. It's also there because actually, while you might not be aware of is that about 73% of disabled people who identify as disabled want to work, and yet there's only 20% employment rate in New Zealand. And much of that is very part-time or piecemeal work. And so there's a push from disabled person-led organisations across the country to try and get the local councils involved in thinking about how they can support disabled people into employment. Because places like a council are really visible. And if you see disabled people working in the council, those who identify as being disabled, then that gives hope. You know, it shows a bit more and a bit more accessible and more visible for other organisations to see disabled people working. So that's why that's here. It's something that, as an organisation, as a group, we're quite passionate to see how we can work with the council. And of course, the footpath renewal program. Yes, there's been discussion about that as well. We've had some achievements. I happened to be at the Festival of Cultures in February. Gosh, that seems like 2 years ago now, doesn't it? And I just was literally in my chair next to some people who did not know me particularly, and they were so excited to see sign language interpreters. They said, oh, we can text so-and-so and they can come down and they can have the interpreter they understand. So I think that's fabulous. You know, those of us that have our hearing just do not appreciate how it is to be without it. Also, the availability of sign language interpreters at the City Council meetings when requested. Again, just to note that actually, because there are limited sign language interpreters for the region, that always will have to be booked in advance. I've mentioned the Streets for People development. That's, yeah. And one of the ones that people have commented to me about is the mobility permitted car park signs, that they're now all 24/7. So all mobility permit car park signs are now equal, or parks are equal. So no one should be parking them at any time unless they have a permitted permit. And the companion card, and this has caused the most excitement in the disability community. And I would probably field 10 to 15 to 20, 15 calls, emails a month saying, where is it? So when's it going to start? And so later this week, Ahmed and I are meeting with Lorna Sullivan, who's the director of Manawhakaha. So I'm really, really, really excited about the possibility of this commencing. Right, next one. So yes, I'd like to thank the City Councillors, the Palms North City Council officers, the welfare team, Karen Naylor and Ahmed, for all the support they've given the Disability Reference Group. Right. Aspirations. Oh, I have aspirations. It's not. There we are. Right. Yes. So I continued working alongside at the Palms North City Council events teams to meet the needs of disabled people, about the employment as well, the voluntary roles. Right. Can you put the next one up, please? The next one. Yeah. So these two, I didn't get the slides right together. To encourage the Palms North City Council to consider the Enabling Good Lives approach. Now, this is an approach around rethinking community and civil participation for disabled people and their families. And what only a few of you will be aware of, there's been an influx of disabled people and their families to this region because of the disability support system trial that's taking place in the mid-central region. And so we really now in 2020 really want to move away from the medical model to a sort of citizenship model of disability. And that's quite different. And so the Enabling Good Lives approach, which nationally I think has been around for 12, 14 years, and there are small trials in Waikato and Christchurch of other groups of disabled people, is an approach to think about the civil participation and sort of allowing disabled people to participate in the community as much as they're able to. Okay. Work with the encourage Palms North City Council to consider assessments on council facilities. and to ensure consideration is given to the needs of people with disabilities. And I'm going to speak slightly to that. So there are some of the community centres that actually aren't particularly accessible. The gutters, curves that you can get, or the curb cuts you get to are way, way, way away from the buildings, if they are at all. Some don't have them at all. You know, just so simple kind of access issues. And when they're not there, I have to say, you feel really unwelcome.
You can just finish off that point if you'd like, Rose.
That's all.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much. That's great, and thank you for the presentation. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Rose, again for presenting to us. Two questions, if I might. The first is around understanding your point around an assessment of council facilities around disability access, etc. Are there established standards around that that could be easily referenced, a framework that we could work with, or would it be how would we undertake such an assessment?
So, I mean, I would believe that all the standards are met by the City Council as such, but that's often not, you know, that's not the sort of the spirit, the actual law and the spirit of the law. There are some organisations nationally and locally that could facilitate some sort of assessment process with the City Council. And I'd be happy to put you and the Council in touch with those organisations.
Great, thank you. That's helpful to understand that. The second question was around, it sounds like the group's been very busy and working on a number of avenues, but just really wanted to understand from a diversity point of view. I suppose there's a lot of diversity within what we refer to as disability, and how geared up the group is to tap into all the different diversity within the disability community living locally, to bring that voice together.
Sure. I think it's fair to say currently we're always looking for more diversity, of course. We have a range age-wise. We certainly have a wide spread of people, and it's not a term I like to use particularly, but in terms of, if you like, bluntly, impairments, we have a wide range of impairments. So at the moment, the Disability Reference Group, people are appointed onto it, and so I think there's always a mind when people are due to be appointed, what do we need to improve or make the mix more diverse, or give, spread.
Cool. Thanks, Rose. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Rose, for this report. Looking at the volunteering side of things and the equal employment opportunities, and even the active citizenship plan, what do you think are the big barriers that are in place, even so far as having someone with a disability at this table? How, you know, what are the barriers from the volunteering steps through to the employment steps through to actually being part of the discussions at the higher tables?
Sure. So let's start with volunteering. I think sometimes the one thing that disabled people need is a little more time perhaps to be at some event, you know, or they might need someone just to drop them off or to carry something to them. So often it's just about logistics. So as opposed to, might be, we want volunteers for X in 2 days' time, a disabled person might need a bit more time for logistics, for the want of that. Employment, I guess, I'm not, you know, that's a bit harder to say why, other than I think disabled people get discouraged. You know, if you apply for job after job after job, and all it seems to be is about the barriers. Because other than this local area where you can access different funding to support a disabled person is very limited, very tightly controlled and very criteria-led. So for many disabled people, it actually doesn't suit them, even though it's the funding allocated to them through MSD. So that would be one thing. Things like, too, sometimes employers aren't prepared to change doors or, you know, simple things, you know, and there's funding for that, but it's a whole mindset change as well. Now, why are there people not in council? I think for many people, the whole idea of citizenship is something new for disabled people as well. I know there was someone who had been was standing for one of the local seats in government, but stepped down, I think, before their health reasons. So I guess that's, you know, one of the reasons as well, your own personal ability, that health-wise to manage that, that's important. Also, I think people just feel naturally shy and maybe that they don't have enough to offer as well. Maybe that lack of citizenship.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Rose, for coming in to speak to us today. Two questions, I think, possibly. One following up from Councillor Barrett's questions around council facilities. You specifically referenced community centres, but that wouldn't be the extent you would expect. You're looking at all council facilities to be assessed.
I don't know. Yeah, I would assume so. Why wouldn't they be? I mean, yeah, I'd assume they all would be. Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify that because you did specifically talk about community centres. And a point I think that came up in discussion with elected members earlier about this was, would you also see that including council's digital facilities?
Sure, because interesting, forgive me, I'm not sure which ministry released it a couple of years ago, but there actually is an agreement between government and many ministries and local government around this digital platform for particularly visually impaired people, those of low vision. And my understanding is there's not been a lot of uptake. I think genuinely because many organisations don't know about it, but it was all signed up to, but it hasn't been much uptake, so certainly. And I think that would be really important.
Thank you. And my second area that I was interested in was the Enabling Good Lives principles. Yes. How widely accepted or incorporated in organisations are those principles?
So they are mostly within the disability sector currently. So I think some of the Waikato DHB might as well. Certainly just from a disabled person led, it seems to have a lot of traction. And it's 11 years old at least, I do believe, nationally, where they went to the government and said, hey, the disability system isn't working. I guess one clarification I'd like to say is that, ironically, I sit in front of you in a wheelchair, so obviously I have, again, an impairment, but I don't necessarily view myself as sick. Do you know there's a difference?
Yes, absolutely.
So, and of course, respectfully, the Ministry of Health, where at the moment all the funding for disabled people under 65 sits, is, of course, Ministry of Health. And a lot of that, of course, is sick people. There's no getting away from that. So it doesn't quite fit disabled people in many ways. So yeah, so that's why there's that push to look at this. This is more important. The 8 principles are, well, some of them are self-determination, person-centred, ordinary life outcomes. And I can't tell you how much disabled people just want ordinary life outcomes. You know, to go to the pub, to have friends, to have a job, to live in a house they choose to. You know, I really, really can't emphasise that strongly enough. Mainstream first, which is a fancier way of saying, actually, as a disabled person, I should firstly access the services that anyone else would do so before going to specialised services. And that's really important with children. Another one, beginning early. In this region, because of this mana whakaha, a lot of families have come in with young children because they can get funding or support. Well, normally the funding and support under medical model doesn't kick in until 13, 14, 15. So that's a huge difference. Mana enhancing. You know, we all want to be treated with respect. And inherently, because of criteria and processes, that doesn't happen always with a medical model. Not intentionally, just one of those sort of things. Easy to use in relationship building. And I was reflecting on the presenter before me. You know, the loneliness, you could have almost transferred that to disabled people.
Thank you for that explanation. That's actually very helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Rose. I've got a couple of questions. In regards to the parking permits, the mobility parking, you gave an example about how you came in the evening and couldn't find a car park.
Yeah.
is it wishful thinking to assume that people who are holders of those permits are now coming out and spending a bit more time in the evenings, and that some of them may have been legitimately parked there, or are you still seeing a sort of complete abuse of those in the evening?
Complete abuse. No one has permits, and I think disabled people have always wanted to go out and be out as often. Just how far are you going to have to be parked from your place you want to be, including that was even last Sunday, even a security firm was parked in the one outside the library, and they had a reason why, and they, you know, so all the car parks were full. So yeah, no. I think there's an assumption after 6 o'clock all disabled people must be either at home or in bed. So, you know, which is false, but yeah.
Still quite a lot of work to do in that space.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My next question was around the audit or assessment, I guess, on council facilities. Sure. And you talked about how there are some organisations that provide that assessment in some degree. And it was mentioned around, you know, community facilities. I guess I'm wondering, is the, and it could be the ideal, but would the desire be that actually that assessment was done across, you know, public toilets, parks, any building or facility the council own, or I guess...
Yeah. Yes, that would be the ideal. Normally, some of the role, if it's accessible, normally the public toilet is, you know, the toilets are as well. But, you know, it's always be great to, you know, really check this, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And then just my final question was around the Enabling Good Lives approach. And I hadn't heard of that until this presentation was circulated, so I did my own Googling. But you've said it's been around for a number of years, and I'm wondering why is that, why is this approach or these principles the one that you are encouraging us to consider? Are there others out there? Is this something that is adopted by the local DHB? Like, what's the driver for selecting this one? Because I imagine there's lots of different sets of principles that we could consider.
There are. I guess I think this one, it's got a lot of traction. There was lots of buy-in from people in the co-design who are sitting in this room or around this area. So it is one that was focused when they chose the mid-central region because of its population that it had. I think it really fits in really well with this. Many of the other approaches are very, very, perhaps Auckland, a lot of them are Auckland region and nowhere else, where this has at least two other places, Waikato, where it started, and Christchurch. I think it's one, of course, there's there's some discussion. It's one that's widely accepted by disabled people and groups as a way of moving forward from medical model to citizenship.
And when you say, you know, encourage council to consider this approach, to what extent are you putting in this request? Are you asking us to adopt it as a blanket approach with every aspect of decision making? Are you wanting it to be woven into the community space? What does it mean for you to have us consider this approach?
I think it needs to be explored and teased out more. I mean, certainly the community, but I guess in some ways, if we looked at it, say, for instance, an ordinary life outcome, let's go back to a volunteer role, an ordinary life outcome is to volunteer for something. Even that kind of, you know, woven into processes. But I think it needs to be explored further, you know, that as an outcome, ordinary life outcome for disabled people, so they can participate more fully in the community.
So would I be right in understanding that what you're asking us to do is have a conversation about those principles and how they could sit with the operations of the organisation?
You would be right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think the General Manager would just like to make a comment about the mobility parking out of hours.
Yes, just following on from your question in relation to that. So some of you may have noticed there was a paper due to come to this committee today in relation to that issue. We're not bringing it, and the reason being is because we're just getting on with it, basically. So we've done some trialling of things. We've also looked at how we could change the way that the parking services work and how we could sort of fit in some after-hours compliance work. So we're just in the process of implementing that. So we will be, we're in the market now for some more parking officers who will be specific, whose job will specifically be to do after hours. It won't be just limited to mobility parking, but to extend basically the scope of our compliance activities. And we've also, of course, using the app that was talked about last time we discussed this as well. So that's already underway. So yeah, so the reason we're not bringing the paper because we just decided we could, we had the ability just to get on and do it and do it within our existing budgets.
Thank you. Councillors, any further questions? No. Okay. Thank you very much, Rose, for your presentation on behalf of the Disability Reference Group. And I note that you're all volunteers in that role. So thank you very much for the time and energy that you put into it. Thank you. So, councillors, we need to resolve that the presentation be received for information. Councillor Rutherford is happy to move that. I'm happy to second. Councillor Naylor has indicated that she has a couple of additional recommendations to put up. But I think what we'll do is we'll comment and vote on this one first, and then we'll have a look at Councillor Naylor's one, if everyone's happy with that. Okay, so is there any comment on the receiving of the presentation? Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a comment around the, I guess, the work that is coming through from the reference group. The workload does seem to be quite full and quite robust in terms of the conversations that are being had, and I guess also to acknowledge staff and those involved in the group, because I really appreciated the comments that Rose made around actually they're involved in decision making and it's not just a sort of tick box group. And I think that we've made strides in recent years around actually how we look at our partnership groups that we've established, and it's really great to see that actually, you know, the skills and the knowledge and expertise that this group brings is being utilised. We're getting bang for our buck, I think.
Thank you. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I took note of the community centre access points, or the lack of them in some cases, and through the infrastructure we'll look at identifying those and addressing. It seems like a pretty readily fix to my mind and would make a massive difference to the disability sector. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd also like to just echo the thanks that's already been given to the amazing work of the group, and I'd just like to acknowledge that there are a few of the group here today. There's Jenny, there's Nats, there's Heather, as well as Rose, and also want to acknowledge the amazing support from Ahmed, who has really resourced the work of this group really well. It's an absolute pleasure to be a part of this group, and there is a real proactive approach and constructive approach from the group in looking at what they can do to make our community a more inclusive place. So I'll leave it at that for now, but speak to the further recommendations later.
Right of reply? Okay, we'll vote on receiving the presentation first. And that has passed, 14 votes for, none against and no abstentions. Now if we could have Councillor Naylor's recommendations on the screen, please. So Councillor Naylor, you've moved these. I've indicated that I'm happy to second them. So would you like to speak to them?
Yeah, that would be great, thank you. So Rose has covered very well a lot of the work that the group have been involved in doing, and inevitably I think the council does a really good job in working to ensure that its infrastructure and services are inclusive, but inevitably there are gaps identified, and I think it's only through hearing it from users' perspective that you realise, as much as there are good intentions, there are some areas where we haven't haven't actually appropriately addressed the needs of the people in our community with disabilities as well as we could. And so instead of, and we've thought a little bit about the best way to progress some of those issues, and certainly the committee will be aware of some of those issues that have come up through, as individual items to the committee. But just to look at how we can address those issues in a broader way, I think that the two recommendations that I'm proposing seeks to really provide a broader lens or a broader framework in which things can be looked at by council to ensure that they are appropriately meeting the needs of the people in our community with disabilities. So the first one, Rose has outlined the Enabling Good Lives principles, and perhaps just to demonstrate an example of how these principles could be utilised, when we perhaps looked at the Parks and Reserves area, and we had staff from Parks and Reserves come and speak to the group clearly identified that what they wanted to see was provision for playground equipment to be across the city, scattered across the city, integrated, rather than in one corner designated for people with disabilities. So that's just an example, not to criticise the way things have been done in the past, but to identify that there's principles of ordinary life outcomes, of mainstream first, of mana enhancing, that guides the way that things are looked at going forward. And I think that'll assist in decision making around how we do things. The second recommendation really is a reflection of the fact that there's been lots of small and some not so small things that have come up through the group that might be down to the size of curbs, of footpaths, down to the way our disability toilets are configured, even some of the comms where the group have said we can't see ourselves in the pictures in the comms that have been put out by council, whether it be crossings, whether it be digital space. So it's really broad, and rather than each thing coming to this committee, we felt that a broader assessment of council facilities and infrastructure being assessed with the needs of people with disabilities in mind would be an appropriate exercise. And I acknowledge this is not perhaps a small piece of work, but I think in identifying this, if the committee are happy to support this, I'm sure that we could get some guidance from staff as to the best way that this could be accommodated, whether it has to be considered through the long-term plan or whether it's something that can be incorporated in the current work. Happy to be guided, but I do think that doing that broader assessment will enable us to be a little bit more proactive in the space rather than waiting for individual things to come up. So, thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wishing to comment? Deputy Mayor, you have a question?
I've got a question on the recommendations to the mover. So just in regards to recommendation 2 there, which is your first one, when you say that council acknowledge, my understanding then is that you're talking about elected members acknowledge these principles and that elected members consider them. So you're not talking about the organisation, otherwise it would be the chief executive?
I'm talking about the whole organisation. So in us giving this, if we're to support this and give this direction, we're obviously acknowledging it here, but it would be my hope that that would be filtered down in terms of staff and the way that they go about doing the work. So it's a broad council in its broadest sense.
Okay, and just to be really clear, you're suggesting that as a result of this, that we then start to integrate these principles. I guess this is not a, through questions with Rose, my understanding was that it was about a conversation around how we could do this, but I'm just confirming that your recommendation is actually seeking to essentially say this is what we're going to incorporate, these principles. It's not really a discussion, it's an action around getting this underway.
I think my understanding from the discussions with the group was that they identified that as a good tool of being able to, of a way of moving forward, and that, I mean, whilst I'm sure that much of what council already does incorporate some of these principles, it really provides a lens or provides a framework of going forward, and it was the tool that was identified by the group as one that they would like council to consider.
Councillor Harper.
Just a question to the officer for number 3. I don't know whether you could answer it. Any indication of the cost around number 3?
No, we wouldn't have a... do you want to answer that, Cheryl?
Thank you. Through the chair, I'm happy to answer that. No, we don't have an indication, but it would need a referral to the long-term plan to look at the budget implications. We do not have the resource to undertake that.
So would the recommendation need to be changed then, Madam Chair? An amendment?
I'm happy that the recommendation gives officers some direction in terms of the course of travel and how that is to be implemented or done. I'm happy for that to be determined by officers. So I didn't feel the need to include it, but...
Okay, so you don't wish to change your recommendation? Okay.
So I'd like to make an amendment to it.
Yes, go ahead.
That it be moved to the long-term plan.
So can you put a form of words down and just bring it up to the administrator? Thank you. Is there anyone else wishing to comment? I'll just make a comment specifically relating to item 2, which is that I think there's actually quite a lot of synergy between the approach in the disability sector and the approach that we're adopting in the multicultural sector, which is to look at an active citizenship type of plan. And I particularly acknowledge the way that the disability sector as a whole does not want to see themselves as part of the medical model. And so I value the Enabling Good Lives principles as a move away from a medical model of disability into an active citizenship model. And so I think that's a highly desirable move. For many reasons, I've sort of got a foot in the disability camp and a foot in the multicultural camp, and so I can see that there's quite a lot of the same direction occurring. So I think that's a very timely resolution. Do we have the words for the amendment? Okay. And Deputy Mayor, are you seconding the amendment? Okay. Just bear with us while we get the amendment typed up. So the amendment is in red on the screen. So it's a preamble to the original amendment, which is that the following recommendation be referred to the long-term plan. Councillor Harper, did you want to speak to your amendment?
I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Anyone else wishing to speak to the amendment? Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to oppose the recommendation to refer it to the long-term plan. I see that the assessment of our facilities to make sure that their disability access and are appropriate is business as usual. And I don't think it needs a big dollar figure review. I think it just needs is business as usual. We identify it, and thereafter, if there's any works that are needed, that then can be referred to the long-term plan. But to get the assessment done, I don't think we need to wait till July next year to even start thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments? Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually support the recommendation because I think the opposite side is that often it becomes business as usual and gets lost in everything else. So if we have a clear directive in the long-term plan, then it's a program of work. So I urge you to support it.
Councillor, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really supportive of the intent behind the recommendation to do a assessment of all our facilities. I actually think that that's really quite critical when we are, particularly with some of the renewals work, that those factors, if there are sort of changes that need to be made, are taken into account then. However, we've already heard from a GM to say that actually this isn't able to be done within existing resource, and I wouldn't want us to do a light once over if we are looking at actually ensuring that all council facilities are inclusive. I would actually want to make sure that we did this properly and had a full assessment done to ensure that actually if there is remedial work required, then that's clearly identified and we can budget for that as well. So I think that the amendment is appropriate.
The Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, a really good discussion, and I think I will support the amendment, because if it was business as usual, we wouldn't be discussing this. So I do think there needs some focus, and I think this isn't we're not sort of pushing this to the side, it's actually focusing on it. There will be some dollars around this, but I think if council leads it, I can recall before coming into council that there was a bit of work, probably in your days, Lou, where they went out and they assessed the whole of the city around accessibility for people. And it wasn't just council facilities, it was the rest of the city, it was shops, it was businesses, it was other leisure facilities. That has definitely fallen by the wayside. So I think there does need to be a little bit of focus on this, and to do it properly, it does need to be referred to the LTP. We're talking about playgrounds, and we're just not talking about say community centres. If you're talking about playgrounds, there's lots and lots of dollars around that, so it does need to be appropriately addressed, and obviously the officers need to give it the real focus. So I ask you to support it, because it'll be done properly then. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Just speaking to the amendment, I mean, I want this work done well and properly, whether it's now or later, but I guess the reason that I was erring away from defining it as specifically as that is that I think some of this work should be a part of our business as usual and may well be able to be implemented as a part of that between now and next year. So, and I agree with Councillor Dennison in that if there are things that are identified through that usual process of assessment, that it would be good to be able to include those in our LTP. So whichever way it's done, I want it to happen, but I won't support the amendment just for those reasons given.
Now, I believe under the new standing orders that the mover of an amendment has the right of reply. So, Councillor Harper, would you like your right of reply? Oh, sorry, Lou, sorry. If you just hang on for a minute. Councillor Finlay.
Yeah, thank you. The Mayor touched on it. Several years ago, when we built the convention centre, we had the wisdom to put a disability toilet in the convention centre, but we put it upstairs, and there was no lift for people in wheelchairs to get up to the disability toilet. That's how we got started. So that was brought out to us by the DPA. The City Council then had an agreement with the DPA for several years for Shane Goodrich, who used to go around with his wheelchair and doing access all around the city. That's dried up because the finances were withdrawn by the council, so DPA could no longer carry on doing those audits around the city. That was also doing shops too. They even brought in wheelchairs and a group of people with disabilities to the council, and every councillor was taken over by someone with a disability, either in a wheelchair, blindfolded, etc., or having their ears blocked, and trying to live for an hour with that disability in the city. It was an interesting situation. The then Mayor, Heather Tangay, fell out of the wheelchair and rolled into the gutter That was quite interesting. There was another councillor that couldn't get in and out of a car in a wheelchair. So those sort of experiences are very good. But unfortunately, we don't have many councillors here who have had those experiences. It would be great if the DPA or some organisation could come along with all the disabilities, and each councillor would have to work with that disability for an hour. Interesting to see the results. So I'm very supportive of bringing the amendment in to make sure it goes into the long-term plan and we can get back to doing something about assisting people with disabilities in the city.
Thank you. Over to you, Councillor Harper.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just to say that I think we're in a constrained environment, and I think because of the constrained environment that we are in, we do need to go and put it into the LTP, and that is probably the final word. I think Councillor Finlay has said a lot, and I think that we do need to listen to his wise words. So I'd like you to support the LTP, to go into the LTP. Thank you.
Okay, what we'll do is we'll just vote on recommendation, we'll just vote on the amendment to recommendation 3 first. So just voting on the amendment. And that has passed 12 votes for and 3 against. So the amendment now becomes part of the substantive. Are people happy for us to take recommendations 2 and 3 together? Okay. So is there anyone else who wishes to speak to comment on amendments to comment on recommendations 2 and 3? Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to speak particularly to the recommendation 3. My comment is not about the assessment itself, but reflecting what appropriately addressed might mean. And noting in Rose's comments in her presentation, she talked, I think she said specifically, she's sure council meets the standards, but her comment was that the standards don't reflect the needs of the community. So for me, there's a piece of work here which is about determining what appropriately addressed means before we determine whether our council facilities meet that standard. And that seems to me to be the difficult part of this work, and probably not something that necessarily causes a huge amount of going out and looking at things, but a discussion potentially with our reference group, with the disability community and other interested parties about where the gaps are in the standards themselves, not necessarily in council's provision. So I'm supportive of the recommendations and keen to see that work get underway. Thank you.
Any further comment before I pass it back to Councillor Naylor for right of reply? No. Councillor Naylor, do you want a right of reply?
Yeah, thank you. Just to add, in terms of the first recommendation, these are principles that have been identified by people that live with disabilities, and so I think that they're the best people who can help guide us in providing a framework. And just in terms of acknowledging the comment made by Councillor Bowen in terms of how we appropriately address that and how we determine what those standards should be, I'm sure that the further contribution of the Disability Reference Group will be key in being able to determine that going forward.
Thank you. So we'll now vote on additional recommendations 2 and 3 together. And they're both carried, 15 votes for, none against, no abstentions. Thank you, Rose. So, councillors, we'll now move on to item number 7, which is confirmation of the minutes. I'm happy to move the minutes as being a true and correct record. Seconded Councillor Bowen. Are there any comments or matters arising? No? Then we will vote, please. Can you just check to make sure your vote has been recorded, please? Thank you. That's carried 15 votes for and none against and no abstentions. So we'll now move on to item 8, which is the Welcoming Communities Annual Report, and that will be presented by Joanne Ransom and Stephanie Velvin.
Morena, thank you for the opportunity to present this report, which is our annual update from the Welcoming Communities program to Council. I'm going to defer to Stephanie Velvin, who is the Welcoming Communities Coordinator, to present this report.
Kia ora koutou. Do I drive this? Cool. So just a brief update. It's been about 12 months since we last came to update about how the Welcoming Communities program is tracking. So we'll cover off the background of the program, some of the highlights from the last year or so, and some of the next steps that we're going to take in the short and medium term. So Welcoming Communities is an accreditation-based program. The intent is to create inclusive communities with a focus on newcomers, particularly those coming from overseas, so international students, former refugees and migrants, though that it is acknowledged that there are benefits for newcomers from other parts of New Zealand as well moving to the city. So it's led by Immigration New Zealand at the national level, and the program Welcoming Communities is part of a global network, so there are similar programs in Australia, Welcoming Cities, in Canada and in the US, and there's also an international organisation called Welcoming International that we're a member of. So it was originally commenced in 2017 with a pilot of 2 years, and that obviously ran to 2019, and it was confirmed last year that the pilot was deemed successful, and now there's a process of expanding the program to up to 30 additional councils. So the expression of interest has just been opened for new councils, and I understand that there have been a good number of councils expressing interest, and there should be some coming on board early 2021. The accreditation that we work towards is an outcomes-based framework. So there are 8 outcome areas that we work across in terms of our welcoming activities that we implement. So I'll talk to a few of those in the highlight section, and a few of those in our next step sort of focus. But we do have activity across all 8 areas currently. Our implementation right from the start has been driven by our Welcoming Communities Advisory Group. So I'd just like to acknowledge we've got a few members of the advisory group here, so thank you for coming along. So the advisory group is made up of some community groups that work with newcomers and represent newcomers, as well as some other central government agencies as well. We were accredited as an established welcoming community in June of this year, so that was a significant milestone, and that is stage 2 out of 4 possible accreditation stages. So just some highlights from the last year, and I've grouped these under 3 of the key outcome areas. So the first of those is welcoming communications. So this is an area where we've really focused over the last 12 to 18 months, and in particular on communications campaigns to promote the key messages of the program to the wider community. So we've had, and we anchor those around sort of key international days. So we've had Welcoming Week in 2019 and in 2020, and that's where the hashtag Palmy Welcomes
came about, and also in line with World Refugee Day in 2019 we had the hashtag with refugees, and most recently we had hashtag Palmy Legends, which is where this image has come from. So we chose to highlight some members of our refugee background community who had contributed particularly during the COVID response. So those campaigns have received a really good response. So we use a variety of platforms, so Facebook, traditional media, complemented by events and activations to try and really reach the wider community. And I'm always really pleased with the positive response that we get from those as well. So a couple of things that work really well that we've found, storytelling, so appealing to the hearts of people, showing the people behind the kind of diversity or newcomer tag, I guess, making sure we have really, really fantastic images and video for people to engage with, and as I mentioned, events and activities as well. So another area where we've been quite strong in the last year or so is in celebrating culture and identity, and this is something that Palmerston North is traditionally really great at. We've had obviously the Festival of Cultures for a long time, but in the last year or so we've grown from the Festival of Cultures being the main public event celebrating culture to adding Eid, Holi, Diwali, Lunar New Year, and a bunch of others into the square and other public spaces. So the idea is that when we bring these celebrations out of the community halls and places where they're traditionally been celebrated, the wider community can engage and learn about that culture. And meanwhile, we also continue to support the smaller scale events and activities in that space as well. The last area that I'll highlight is in terms of equitable access. So this is around access to information and services for newcomers. So our City Welcome sessions were one of the first activities that we introduced early on in the pilot, and they've continued to grow and evolve as we've learnt more about what works. So the most recent session we held at Te Manawa, in the Māori history section there, and we created a really great atmosphere of welcome, led by Te Ahi Kaia, who are the Rangatane Kapahaka group. And they are now attended by a range of newcomers from all backgrounds. So we've got young professionals, families who have moved from elsewhere in New Zealand, as well as migrants, postgrad international students, and former refugees coming along as well. So we do have other activities in this area that have been well established, including our welcome packs, which are very popular. Those are distributed at the library, the Multicultural Centre and the iSite, as well as online. We engage in international student orientations and student orientations, and recently, end of last year, we developed a series of videos, multilingual welcome videos, to be used in the Red Cross orientation. So they were information that will be useful for that group of newcomers, delivered in the first language that is most useful for them. So another thing that has come about in the last 12 months or so is we've taken a bit of a leadership role in the program nationally. So that's because we've maintained a continuous level of activity, I think, and because we've continued to innovate by bringing in new activities to our suite of things that we're doing under Welcoming Communities. For this reason, we also get regular profiles in Immigration New Zealand's quarterly settlement magazine called Actions, and our work is often also profiled by Welcoming International, the global body. They're really interested in what we're doing here in Palmerston North, and they like to highlight the new activities that they're not seeing over there to try and encourage people to think a bit differently. And in particular, our COVID-19 response, which was really inclusive in the way that we designed, in particular, the welfare response, received a lot of positive attention around the world. So in terms of next steps for this end of this year and beyond, so obviously we're seeking to maintain and continue to embed these activities that we've developed over the last 3 years. It's also come time to develop a new welcoming plan to take us to that next level, with a focus on some of the areas where we haven't done so much work, so welcoming public spaces. We recently did a multicultural edition of the Passport to Play, and that was really revealing of the lack of things we have in our public spaces that reflect the multicultural identity of the city. So we'll do some work in that space. Economic development, business and employment. We're continuing to hear from newcomers that it's difficult to access the labour market, access jobs, skilled jobs, so continuing to work in that space and in the civic engagement space in terms of active citizenship in particular. We'll also work on our monitoring and evaluation in line with this new plan, so being a little bit more strategic in the way that we're measuring the impact of what we're doing, so we'll build that into this new document. And of course, taking a leadership role informally in the rollout to new councils. So we're hoping that some of our neighbouring councils will come on board and we can really take advantage of those connections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and I'd also like to acknowledge members of the Welcoming Communities Advisory Group who've taken the time to come in this morning. Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions about the report? Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Stephanie, for the report. This is very much a good news story for Palmerston North. My question was came out of a discussion we had at the Palmerston North Defence Heritage Advisory Group, which is also attended by staff. So this may have come to you through a different route. But it was a concern that was raised there about how we use or might use welcoming communities to explain to potentially vulnerable new members of our community about the prevalence of defence personnel on the streets of Palmerston North, recognising particularly if we're working with people who come from, maybe come from a former refugee background, who might come from potentially war-torn areas of the world, that might seem quite confronting. So, yeah, how do we reflect the very active role of the Defence Force in our city, both with our former refugee communities and maybe potentially into that work this year that you were just talking about in the economic development space?
Thank you. That's not something that I'd heard of before, so that's really interesting to consider. We have had a similar conversation in terms of police and how they're viewed by different groups of newcomers, and I know that there's lots of work done in terms of that orientation period in particular with former refugees and international students, bringing in the police and other uniformed people to be the friendly face and front foot that right from the start. So yeah, that's probably something we can consider as well in terms of the Defence Force.
I'll probably link the Defence Heritage Group into that conversation. Thank you, that's useful.
Thank you. Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this report. I was particularly interested in some of the activities that you've got planned for the next 6 months, July to December, which we're sort of halfway through at the moment, on page 41 of our documents. In one of the bullet points you've said civic engagement activities around the general election, and I was wondering if you're able to elaborate on what you did there
Yeah, so with the general election, obviously the Electoral Commission have the lead role in that space, so we were working to complement their activities and put the welcoming communities lens over what they had planned. So we met with our regional people from the Electoral Commission. We tried to get as many resources as possible from them and disperse those out to the community. It was challenging to access some of those resources, in particular in the languages that we need for our community. So that's a work on for the next welcoming plan, definitely. Yeah, and I guess aside from that, we did some work through our Facebook platforms, just making sure that we promoted the election and voting and information that was available. The Office of Ethnic Communities had a little bit of stuff that came out, but it was quite late in the piece, so yeah.
Fair enough. Do you know if there was an increase in people from those communities getting involved in, or is it too early to tell at this stage?
I haven't seen any data, so yeah, might be too early at this stage, but.
Cool. The other one I was interested in was the Cultural Confidence Staff Toolkit that you'd mentioned in there. I was wondering how that's going. Is that for City Council staff?
Yeah, so that would be within the organisation. So we've set up a bit of a group. There are a number of roles in council that are interested in this space, and we're having those conversations. We haven't rolled anything out yet. It has been a slightly disrupted year, as you know. Yeah, so that we have a group that are interested in those common goals. So yeah, we're having the conversation.
Cool. And the last one I was really interested in was the welcoming schools education concept and how that works.
Yeah, so again, that's a new activity that we're looking to explore. So we've got our great global parents group in the city who do a little bit of work, and of course we work with the Palmerston North Intermediate Normal through the First Voice program, so looking to kind of expand on some of those ideas that are working well, working with the community groups that are already interested in this space, and seeing what we can develop in terms of tools and packages that can go out to the wider school community.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Councillors, I'm looking to adjourn this meeting at 11:15, so if you can just keep your questions brief, and maybe if staff can keep the answers brief, we'll try and just get through questions on this item before we break. So, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very briefly, well done, Steph and the wider team. I think it's really reflecting on who and what the city is. Just on those welcome packs, just very briefly, what is in them?
So in the welcome pack is a booklet of information which was developed with the advisory group, which sort of talks about day-to-day information that you might need to know, rubbish, shopping, all sorts of sort of key topics in there. There's also a bingo card which has things to do activity, so aiming to get people out and about in the city in those first sort of few weeks that they're here. There's also a Kiwi phrases lingo card, which is just a little bit of fun for someone who might have English as a second language, all in a folder.
Okay. Just a second part to that, very quickly. Is there any businesses or other community groups put stuff in there?
Not businesses, and that was an intentional decision by the advisory group to keep it sort of neutral information. Though, I mean, a business could pick up a bunch of packs from the iSite and then distribute those with a flyer in. The library brochure goes in at the library. MMC put in their activity information. So it's designed so that there can be additions, but we haven't included anything.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Briefly, brilliant work, Stephanie. Really great to see this expanding. And just my question is around, as the program continues to mature and continues through time, Have you thought about, I guess, ways of measuring success that go beyond the sort of activity-based approach, which is what we're seeing now, which is, I think, quite appropriate for where we're at. But as it continues, have you considered that what indicators there might be around longer-term or broader impacts?
Yeah, so that's the piece of work that I mentioned around monitoring and evaluation that we are looking to build into this next welcoming plan rollout. And that's across the program as well. So we recently had a workshop in Wellington where we had a whole day session on monitoring and evaluation and how we could pull out some of those impacts from what we're doing, because it's a common issue across the space when you're working kind of in the soft stuff, I guess. It is hard to measure and sometimes the data isn't there. So yeah, it's about creating a program of what we wanted to collect in terms of data and then working towards that over the next 3 years.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steph. That's great, and I just think it's been tremendous, actually. Well done to you and the team. Councillors, we will adjourn now for morning tea, and we'll resume. No, I don't. We will resume after the infrastructure presentation. So, thank you.